My guest tonight is Jay Dyer. He returns to the show. Hey, Jay, how you doing?
Great, Tim. How are you?
Very well, very well. Of course, Jay is the proprietor of Jay's Analysis, the website that analyzes pop culture, literature, history, you name it. Jay, you're running a recent series. Well, first of all, your book. Your book has been delayed, Esoteric Hollywood, I'm sorry?
Yeah, actually, I'm having to work with the publisher on the road, so I talked to him for about an hour this morning, and we went through one of the chapters, and I think what we're going to do is go chapter by chapter, and basically we're wanting to add in kind of sidebars and a glossary that'll kind of give readers who may not be as familiar with the lingo and the jargon that we swim in, that we're so used to, just to kind of give them a handle on ideas like Manichaeanism or what psychological warfare is, or these kinds of things, that just to make the book more accessible. So we got some of that complete today, and that means that really we're just looking at a couple more months, I think.
Okay.
And then it'll be ready.
Yeah, it's kind of when turning the stuff into a book isn't as easy as it sounds.
It's not. It's not bad. It's just a tedious process, and you get so used to being immersed in this stuff that you kind of forget that most people aren't aware of what Manichaeanism is, or they're not aware of semiotics or these different philosophical terms. So
yeah,
get stuck in a bubble. So need to I think it makes sense. I think it'll make it better for the average reading audience.
Yeah, you're not dumbing it down. You just make it more.
No, right.
More pedestrian.
Exactly. We're sticking, glossary and sidebars that'll explain, what this is, who this is.
Oh, I see. So exactly, you like almost have to reconstruct how the plates are going to look, right? If they still use plates.
Well, he's having to do that, right? It's like the plates of tragedy and hope, right? Right.
It's a conspiracy, Jay. They're going to delay you. So that's great. So we're looking at kind of like early fall, I guess.
I think he's saying September, October at the earliest, hopefully, and then November, December latest. But I don't. I think we're rocking along pretty good. So.
Okay. Well, okay. Well, got you on tonight. You're doing a lecture series on tragedy and hope. Carroll Quigley's monumental magnum opus. And your first part, you covered bankster scams leading up to the First World War. You talk about dialectics, communism, socialism, National Socialism, libertarianism, neoliberalism, and a whole bunch of things. So let's dive right into it. This lecture, I listened to it. It's great. I listened to it several times. So I want to compliment you on that for wading into this thing and actually putting the time and effort. And it was a fascinating analysis. So where do you want to begin with this?
Well, I covered about the first 200 pages, so I appreciate that, and I had a tremendous response. First of all, I want to say thank you to all the people that promoted it and signed up. I had, I think, immediately 30 people subscribe right away just from the topic, so thank you to all those people. And, yeah, so what we have in this first chunk is basically he begins talking about the European shift, which is what Quigley terms the ideological, sociological transformations that took place post Enlightenment, post Scientific Revolution, post Protestant Reformation. And what he does there is he lists, I think, about 8 things that he says really shifted, that took Western society in a different direction than it previously had been in what we might loosely term, quote, traditional. And so the liberalism of that period, according to Quigley, included nationalism. It included, I'll explain a little bit more about that because we tend to think of nationalism as, quote, far right nowadays. But at that time, the French Revolution was fairly nationalistic, and could be argued that was largely a merchant revolution, and then, of course, supported by shadow interests, probably out of London or other areas like that. And these revolutions that started occurring were, of course, I would say, in a more conspiratorial vein, through the hidden hand of Freemasonry and other subversive organizations. And even though Quigley, interestingly, doesn't discuss Freemasonry, what he does talk about is all of the ideals that are taught by Masonry, right? So he talks about secularism in that 8-point list that he gives, nationalism. I'm speaking from memory here, so I may not remember them all off the top of my head, but there was liberal economic theory, classical liberal economic theory, the idea of separation of church and state, which I guess you could class as secularism. There was the idea of religious freedom and tolerance, and basically
Material
a monetary. I'm sorry?
Sort of inevitable progress or something was one of them too, I think.
Oh, yes, right. The generic idea of progress, faith in science, that was another one. The notion of basically monetary shift, right, a shift towards monetarism, which echoes another famous thinker that I think is very insightful, Oswald Spengler, who in the Decline of the West talked about Faustian man, and then Faustian man, which he saw as representing the ethos, the spirit of Western man. But that transitioned into what he called Homo economicus, economically focused man. And this would, of course, be synonymous with the rise of the banking establishment. Now, that's not to say, of course, that there weren't kind of the same old banking scams, even into ancient civilizations like Babylon or Egypt, but rather that in the modern world it takes on a kind of a new power, I guess you could say, in terms of being global. And so that's really the central thrust of what Quigley discusses early on in the book, is that the European shift was more or less a shift in the entirety of the society, right? So the social order shifted away from monarchy, away from crown and cope, away from throne and altar, towards the ideas of democratic, quote, republicanism, towards the ideas of classical market liberalism, towards the ideas of, as you mentioned, secularism, faith in science, and so forth. And, I mean, he's not a conspiratorial thinker, but he does come pretty close to saying, that these movements were engineered, especially as we get towards the 20th century. So it's really into the 20th century that he says this is where we have the full flowering of the banking establishment and the great banking houses that were able to basically restructure society down different lines. And that's why, even though he doesn't talk about Masonry, I can link it directly to Freemasonry, because it's all the stated goals of Freemasonry, even openly so, that spread into all these nations, be it Western, be it Europe, and then ultimately even into Russia and the Far East, even into the 1700s, I think, under Catherine the Great, Masonic lodges started appearing in France. So I think that's an important angle to point out that Quigley doesn't deal with, because he's a military historian and he's working from CFR archives. These are networks that would fall under the aegis of the intelligence establishment, and I really see most of the secret society networks as kind of arms of the shadow government or the intelligence networks. And so that's where we are, he says, the modern world up to the 20th century. And then he also talks about important economic shifts that take place that lead to reorganization, such as obviously the Industrial Revolution, massive shifts in the conceptions of class, right? This begins to disappear, and instead of a caste-based society, it begins to turn into kind of, as we mentioned, monetarism, or a bourgeois-based society where the elite are no longer nobility, but rather banksters. And, of course, also the corporate class, which we could just class under Homo economicus, Spengler. So that's where we are, and then he's basically wanting to lead us up to World War I and explain what brought that about, how we got to it, and it's more or less admitted by him. I think one of the most important initial admissions is that a gold note scam, where the banksters basically create money out of nothing based on this older plan of the gold note, the gold certificate, and since the bank could have pay, a certain amount of gold on hand. Then they could basically get everybody to use the gold certificate. And since most people, a very small fraction, would ever cash in the gold to redeem the gold, they could then inflate the amount, increase the amount of gold notes, 10 to 1, 100 to 1, whatever it might be, to then control the currency, control the market, and then charge interest based on fiat currency, right? Basically, this is the whole point of fiat currency. And then you can charge interest and make money, which is basically just a representation of other people's time, wealth, and energy that they're paying you on interest that you on money that you've created out of thin air because you basically have the repository of actual gold. And this, Quigley admits, is a scam by the bankers. Right away, he admits that. And this will tie into the central banking system that all of the Western countries will eventually adopt. And that gets up into the end of the lecture that I did, because we get into post-World War I, Treaty of Versailles, and the BIS, Bank for International Settlements, being set up, and that leads to World War II and the Bretton Woods system. But before we get to that, there was the events that lead up to World War I, and there's a lot that he talks about. Very hard to distill all this tiny print of 200 pages within 2 hours. But there's a lot of factors leading up to World War I. The situation in Germany with economic issues, and what I think stands out most is that you have a concerted plan on the part of the British and the West to target Germany. And this ties into talks that you've done in the past with Mark Packard, where you looked at the Great Game and Heartland Theory, Rimland Theory, and you mentioned some really salient points with Mark about Russia, right? Because a big part of this is the Great Game. And I should add as well that Quigley begins the book in, I think, the second or third chapter with a blasting diatribe against Russia. So Russia is the most backwards, useless, redneck nation in the world. They're just the worst ever. Why? Well, because they have this imperialist idea, and they believe in Orthodox Christianity, and those things are they're just so not progressive. They're so yesteryear. And it's the West with its liberal democracy, right, that is going to save the world. And as I mentioned in the talk, the tragedy of the title is the world wars of the last century, the hope being that liberal democracy will save the world, which is, of course, the final chapter of the book. But back to World War I in Germany. So, yeah, you were talking about the importance that Britain saw in a weakened Germany, because Germany was, along with Russia, one of the key rivals to the British Empire. So Quigley, of course, discusses all this, the kind of the decline of the British Empire and the loss of some of their colonies, such as India. And so he doesn't explicitly talk about the British going shadow or secret, but he more or less admits it in that the British establishment is who's behind World War I and II, which Quigley will explicitly admit, amazingly. And this will be the group that he will title the Clivenden Set. The Clivenden Set will be the same as the Rhodes Milner Roundtable Group. This would be people like William Stead, the Astors, Lord Milner, Lord Curzon. I mean, there's just a whole slew of these persons. Cecil Rhodes, John Ruskin. And it is Cecil Rhodes, John Ruskin, and others that form this where it quickly does get conspiratorial, is he calls it a secret society. And it's called the Circle of Initiates. They are the inner core. And outside of them is the outer core of dupes who believe the propaganda, and they're called the helpers. And this is quite fascinating because it very much backs up, from a geopolitical perspective, the analysis that I've been pointing out in regard to scientific and academic domination on the part of the Royal Society, because it's the Royal Institute for International Affairs that is the kind of the central thinking body behind the roundtable groups, and then by extension in the U.S., the CFR and the Trilateral Commission. These are all based on the same pattern models. So that proves, again, that the Royal Society, be it in science or in geopolitics, is really who's shaping things from behind the scenes. And that's why, the Royal Society nowadays still gives out the Darwin Award, right? So as you pointed out in the interview with Mark Devlin, we're talking about, Royal Society science. And here we're talking about Royal Society geopolitical skullduggery. Mm-hmm. So yes, Quigley discusses the geostrategic aspects that you mentioned with Mark. Hackard about weaken Germany, make sure that there's a divide between Germany and Russia. Don't ever have Germany and Russia linking up. That could be the worst thing for the British. And that's really what a lot of the backdoor espionage stuff was concerned with, that Mark's done several translations relating to as history archive. And this is where we come to with World War One. So World War One was a banker-designed war. It was a lot of these same groups, these same bankers and same elite British set. And they realized that out of all of this would come, of course, the League of Nations, but not just the League of Nations, but also the beginnings of a global monetary system. That's really what they were aiming for, and what would lead to World War II, right? So you get a lot accomplished through a world war. You get even more accomplished through a second world war. And really it's about the economics. It's about the establishing of that Federal Reserve central banking model in all the nations, ultimately. And then it's kind of a mopping up exercise over time. So I've rambled for a long time here, but I just thought it tied in very well with, many of the points that you made with Mark Hackard and that Heartland theory, Grinland theory, Alfred Mackinder discussion that you guys did. It's Quigley's basically confirming all of that, mm-hmm. and saying that he really is the Royal Society, City of London, who is behind the wars. And he also, you'll notice a lot of times that he doesn't, it's hard to explain, he doesn't come right out and say that something is a false flag or a planned assassination or something. He'll kind of dance around it and say, there's good possibility that the British actually, the Admiralty actually sank the Lusitania to provoke the U.S. out of its older, quote, isolationist perspective, to goad them into a provocation to entering World War One. And then he will say, he'll mention the nationalist factions behind the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which is supposedly what kicks this off. And he doesn't mention British intelligence explicitly, but he does mention British intelligence explicitly with the Lusitania. So I think we could perhaps extrapolate that, well, it's probably the British hand. That's the real black hand behind the black hand, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so Quigley is kind of dancing around that, but more or less admitting a lot of those same points. And so that's what brings us into World War One, and this, we find out that from Quigley is ultimately about very much about Germany and Russia. It's about weakening and destroying Germany. It's about probably at that time, with the eugenicist-based establishment, the idea of killing a lot of people in a war, and then the reparations are key, because the reparations and Wilson's 14-point plan and the new what is he called, the new Freedom Initiative, New Freedom Doctrine, or whatever, the same thing that Bush borrowed from the New Freedom of Woodrow Wilson and the 14-point plan and all that, that will lead to this guise under which, sorry, Germany, you lost the war. Now your sons and your sons' sons owe us billions of dollars, right? Mm-hmm. And what that is ultimately a scam to not just enslave the people, but to set the precedent for, as we will see with the BIS, and the Bretton Woods system eventually after World War II, is the establishment of the dollar as the world reserve currency. So that's ultimately what it's about. Now, that does not mean that I think, I'm sure you would agree, that it's America that is behind the conspiracy. Rather, it is these inner Oxford networks that are behind it, because they will use America as the engine, for so much of this warfare, as they still do today.
Yeah.
Right. And I'm not trying to leave out, Zionist or Israeli role in that. That will come to play a larger role, later on. But it is actually also World War I with Balfour Declaration and so forth that will lead to the establishment of the State of Israel, modern State of Israel, which is a socialist, situation based on the teachings of Moses Hess and others. And I view Israel as a kind of outpost for the Atlanticist establishment. I don't really see it as the ultimate, controlling factor. You could look at the fact that the intelligence networks there were also set up by British. So just like with the U.S., the OSS being set up, with the aid of Bill Donovan and Ian Fleming and others. So you're going to start to see that the same network, the British Intelligence Network and the Oxford Network and so forth, roundtables, this ties directly into a lot of what I've talked about with Fleming and the irregulars. You've mentioned William Stevenson and Intrepid several times. That's all going to tie in together because it's the same people. Right? They're working for these same people that I'm talking about. And so it was vital for the City of London shadow government to convince America and American public opinion to go along with getting back into these world wars. And so that's where the stagecraft and the psyops come in. And I know I've been rambling for a long time, but one of the neatest things that I didn't really expect, diving deeper and deeper into Quigley, was that he talks about fake and stage news, which of course is a very important aspect of warfare, military exercise, and psyops. Most of warfare is psyops, like Sun Tzu said. So, he will say that in the wake of this Lusitania situation, which looks to be quite clearly a false flag, even mainline historians will say that the French and the British were both running fake and exaggerated news stories to hype up public opinion to support this initial World War. So that kind of is what leads us up to World War I, and I'm sure you would have quite a few insights on, which I'd love to hear, if you could enlighten me, on this role of Germany, Bismarck and so forth in relation to Russia and Britain in this regard, and why they really needed to weaken. And I do agree with you too, by the way, that from the Oxford Atlanticist banking establishment view, yes, they did want to weaken the Holy Roman Empire and the Catholic ethos. There's no question about that. That's an important angle that even Quigley doesn't really get, because you'll notice as you read the book, as I'll point out, Quigley is not very adept at understanding religion or theology. That was not his forte. So he will make these very glib, naive statements like, well, the West is going to be good because we believe in kind of the basic teachings of Jesus, like love. And, these Catholic countries and these, Russian Orthodox countries, they're all weird, backwards rednecks. They don't get, freedom, man, democracy, man. And that's literally the kind of childish, perspective he'll take in what I call the more propagandist chapters.
Yeah.
And you have to understand that, the book is very revealing, but it's also an apologetic. It's an apologetic for the Western banking establishment and their approach and their strategy. And there are propaganda chapters. And even if you don't like the whole ethos of Russia or the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs or whoever, it's still very, what's the word I'm looking for? Unsophisticated. The approach that Quigley takes to
puerile,
to dismissing those, traditions, and that there might be something more to say Christianity or Christian culture than, love your enemies, man.
Well,
I'm not kidding.
As if the British Empire, the Western powers, follow Jesus.
As if they love their enemies, man. Exactly. That's a great point.
Yeah, I'm sure that's what the CIA is thinking about. What would Jesus do before they, overthrow
And
the government?
the amazing hypocrisy of the book is that Quigley will admit, oh yeah, the bankers, pretty much engineered all these wars, and that's what they wanted, and they were the ones that were at the big conferences, Yalta and Versailles and Dawes Plan and all that. Yeah, it was all international bankers drawing it up. But don't worry, because the Western banking establishment is the best hope for the world.
Well, I think it was Lloyd Blankfein who said he's doing God's work.
Oh, there you go.
He's getting bailed out to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, Goldman Sachs, doing God's work. So, God's on our side. Oh, okay.
Lucifer?
Yeah, that's the irony. It's get to the Masonic thing in Lucifer. But what you mentioned, Homo economicus by Spengler. That concept. That I guess that factors into the Manchester School in England, sort of the Scottish Enlightenment with Adam Smith and Bentham and
Thomas Reed. Yeah,
utilitarianism, which became kind of American pragmatism, I guess you could say. It's kind of
absolutely. Amen.
And so these ideas aren't just woolly out in the air. These things have practical applications because this forms the ethos, the guiding spirit of the British Empire, and just justifies
which is materialism, I should add.
Yeah.
And, pragmatism and Bentham and all those guys and utilitarianism are direct, literal outworkings of that kind of materialism. And materialism goes along with that quantification that Rene Guénon and people have discussed. This transition into materialism, focusing on empiricism. All those guys that you mentioned were empiricists, and it's the British empiricists who lead the way in epistemology as well. So Locke, Bentham, Bentham would be classed in that too. Locke, Berkeley, Hume, and this leads to situationalist ethics. This leads to positivism in philosophy. This leads to pragmatism, as you mentioned, and it also leads to scientism. Because all of those guys were into hardcore scientism, and that's where we get this Royal Society angle. Because a lot of these guys are in the Royal Society too.
And another dimension of this also is I guess you could say British philo-Semitism. There's been a sort of a,
yes, the British Israeli theory, and it's very bizarre. Yeah, right. Now I'm not just talking about that weird Worldwide Church of God cult with Garner Ted Armstrong. I'm actually talking about prior to this, you have this older. I don't even know where. It's kind of a Gnostic idea that derives out of all that gobbledygook and conspiracy realms of René Le Chateau and all this stuff with the St. Clairs and all this. But there is an element of truth to this because they do seem to adhere to the Gnostic theory that Joseph of Arimathea and Mary Magdalene and Jesus' children or something, or that the British nobility are the descendants of Jesus, which is obviously a preposterous concocted mythology to prop up the imperial mythos. But yes.
Same with the Carolingians, right, or Merovingians, right? Don't they claim to be descendants of Joseph and the house of?
There are, the Merovingians do, but of course the British monarchs, you have the conquering of the British by the Norman invasion back in the 11th century, I believe, and then you have the present quote Windsors are of course Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and then they actually are Romanian Transylvanian too. So
Dracula.
But by the way, Dracula. That I know you know this, but for those listening, actually, researched Dracula as well. A lot of that's baloney.
I know.
They'll call him. He was because he was Catholic and because he fought Islam. That he's supposedly bad or something because he would put heads on stakes. But is the British Empire not bad for pulling people's guts out, putting their heads on stake outside the Tower Bell?
Machine gunning natives in Sudan. So.
Yeah, I believe that was Colonel Dyer I was just reading about. Actually, I don't know if I'm related to him or not, but Colonel Dyer, I think the Dyer massacre, he massacred a whole bunch of Indians
Was that on
in
a star or something?
it was in India. I forget the date, but
Yeah.
yeah, it was when India was trying to achieve independence. And I've actually wondered for a while if the British did not send in their peace agent Gandhi to quell the actual revolution and turn it into a walking around the streets peaceful quote revolution by this guy who I think is pretty obvious British agent, but
he was a British lawyer, right? I mean, British trained lawyer.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
I mean,
you start.
Yeah.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I'm saying you start to look back in these things. You look at more current events, more recent events about whether it's COINTELPRO and
well, that's what. Yeah, that's what you say. You read several books on British intelligence, even that are kind of mainline. You'll start to see that pattern, as I mentioned, that they, as I'm sure all intelligence agencies do, have the foresight to say, okay, well, it looks like the opinion is swaying towards, XYZ group, the Front National group or the People's Liberation group. So all you got to do is just buy off the leader of the new incoming group, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you just need that guy. And I would suppose, I don't have any evidence, but I would suppose that's why, that Indira Gandhi, right? Doesn't she become president of India as well later on, as descendant? So that's just an easy way to ensure that it doesn't matter what new ideology comes in, as long as you can get the heads of that ideology. And I think we see the same thing, in my opinion, with the Ayatollahs who come in after the Shah. I mean, they're just another, according to Dreyfus, I think, and I think Curtis too, Ayatollah Kashani was just another asset that was bought off by Western intelligence. So they don't care whether it's an Ayatollah or a Shah. Now there might be a situation where they really want to overthrow and foster a coup. Certainly that happens. I'm not denying the coups. I'm just saying there's many means and methods by which you can get the job done.
Yes, and it does say something when you realize that all these supposed independent leaders are usually come out of the London School of Economics or Oxford University. Right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, how many of these mullahs and ayatollahs go to Edinburgh and Oxford? Right?
Yeah.
Cambridge.
Are they role playing? So. But
exactly.
And it's interesting because you mentioned the British, the idea they're the new Zion, they're the chosen people. This kind of, and I think it was in the Norman invasion that the Jews were introduced to the British Isles, and then they were kicked out in around 1290, I believe. And they sought to be reintroduced under Cromwell. He failed in that regard, but he was given money by the Amsterdam Jews to help bring them back in, and they were introduced again back in your Jewish emancipation. So, and of course, you have Palmerston and his support for Israel, and the growth of the Rothschilds in England, and their support for Zionism, and their intrigues regarding the acquisition of the Suez Canal. And this
I was
is again,
about to say, that Quigley has a section where he discusses Disraeli as Rothschild agent to acquire the Suez Canal, which gives quite a bit of geostrategic upper hand.
Mm-hmm. And this is, I guess, the 1860s, 1870s. And Disraeli was a big advocate of, big England versus Gladstone, who was a little Englander, and that debate that was going on in England at the time. But Disraeli, I think there's an episode on Queen Victoria, the PBS documentary, where Disraeli goes to Rothschilds for the funds to acquire the Suez Canal because Parliament was not in session, and he wasn't sure that he could secure the funds, and he borrowed the money from Rothschilds. And Rothschilds is reported to have asked, "What collateral do you have?" And Disraeli's response was, "The British state."
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, and of course, what is Rothschilds? They're bankers, Jewish, but they're also bankers. The premier banking family, right?
Yes.
And that gives you an idea of how it's done, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and of course, keep in mind as well that the majority of this establishment also have that worldview of Malthusianism, of Charles the Galton, Darwin, of Charles Darwin, T.H. Huxley, Ernst Haeckel, all of that crew that are the ideologues, and obviously Aldous Huxley as well. They all have that very, very committed naturalistic view, which believes vehemently in dysgenics. And so, it's accurate to say that dysgenics is the banker worldview. If we talk about Hitlerism fits into that as well. Hitlerism is a version of this philosophy, and it is this same establishment that was interested in the buildup of Hitler, and that's what's so enlightening that we will get into, I think, probably in lecture 2 or 3, in regard to the Clivenden set and their backdoor deals, the 7-point plan that they had, backdoor deal with Hitler, which they then ran fake news in Britain to actually hype up the threat of Hitler. Hitler was not, according to Quigley, nearly the threat that he was made to be in the British press. And what's ironic and funny here is that the Clivenden set, through their publication organs, were running all this war threat, hype, fear, to get the British people angry at Hitler, while the British establishment had made a deal with Hitler, and then this would ultimately lead to the war. In other words, they wanted a deal, they wanted him to build up, but then they wanted a war.
Yeah, the bombing, the Blitz of London by the Luftwaffe, it was a reaction to British bombing of the Ruhr, and the British are the ones that started bombing civilians, and we now know that was done on purpose to provoke a German response to create what the British referred to as a war psychosis, war fever.
Yeah, and it's important to remember.
And they needed to up the civilian casualties in London. That was the objective.
Yes, exactly. And Quigley says they made up a lot of this in the news. A lot of these news stories that you'll read about World War II, about these bombings are exaggerated, which comes as no surprise to us. But yeah,
if you look at much of the war itself, and it's not too surprising that, of course, go back to World War I. You have the Bryce Report and the rumors of German atrocities, the stories, the reports of German atrocities. Bleeding Belgium and these things that are going on. These are either just simply made out of whole cloth, or they're wild exaggerations, because from any war you can extrapolate or exaggerate and create atrocities. And, of course, this follows into the Second World War with much of the reporting coming out. And we look back at much of what came out of World War II, and most people simply swallow it, as gospel, that the reports they got out of the war, the atrocities are true. But they're all controlled by the Office of War Information, OWI, OSS, all psychological warfare. We now know that much of that was faked or wildly exaggerated for the purposes of post-war geopolitics. And
this should not be a surprise to us nowadays. Now that what we see is all of the exact same stuff, just ramped up, multiplied by about 10,000 through mainstream media.
Yeah. Because I'm not condoning or excusing the Hitler or Germany's conduct during the war. Obviously, when they go in and they hurl 3 million men at Russia and they invade these countries, you're going to have a whole lot of innocent people dying.
It's important to see that for the inner circle, they're not anti-Hitler, right? So, in other words, if what we're criticizing here is the British establishment in their, to some degree, pro-Hitler view.
Well, it's a dialectic. It's a dialectic, right?
Right, but the Hitler's, I'm trying to remember, he mentions Ribbentrop, and I can't remember if it's Goering or one of the top guys in Hitler's cabinet, was intimately tied into the Clivenden set. He would go and hang out at the Astors and hang out with both of them, if I recall, quite frequently. So these are not enemies. These are friends who, I guess in kind of the classic medieval style of warfare, where you go and you talk to the heads of House Harkonnen and the heads of House Atreides, and they decide, oh well, we will engage in warfare next summer for 6 months, and then so it's that kind of situation too. And what I think, I guess, is where people who are good at this can debate, as Dr. I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about people much more learned than myself. But like with Dr. Spence, you get into the questions of Hess and Hess's flight, and was Hess just therefore a British mole?
Yeah, and I think he made the point that from the standpoint of Hess, he just because he's working with the British doesn't mean that he's not a German patriot. Meaning,
sure,
he could see by working with the British that that's the best, from his perspective, the best thing for the German nation or the people, or how they people at that level tend to view politics. But I'm saying, it's again, you're not necessarily, you don't assume that just because the German leadership see the British leadership as enemies. It can be, they're working together to achieve something. In fact, Hitler himself saw himself as kind of coming to some sort of agreement or modus vivendi with the British because he admired the British Empire.
Right. Right, and many of the British elites would continue to even openly be, pro-Hitler. What was it, King Edward VII? Is it?
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and people might find that mysterious. Like, what is going on? Well, once you read Quigley, it's like, oh yeah, because they're all partying at the Astros.
Mm-hmm. So
not all of them, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So, and that also explains how many Nazis were integrated so easily into the national security, the CIA and the national security after World War II. It's like, yeah, they're a natural fit. There's no conflict here.
Yeah, directly into NASA, which is another big lying institution, right?
Yeah. So, but in your talk, you bring up things like, one thing is, again, you mentioned how Quigley, he's writing in Chapter 3 regarding Russia. It's kind of a Cold War polemic, where it's almost like, I guess he's writing this in somewhere between 1947 and 1966. This is the high Cold War period, right?
Absolutely.
So he's writing for that, and he in many ways he comes across sounding like George Kennan or something in making this argument.
Yeah, I mean it's a completely polemic. I mean, I don't think there's anything good. I mean, he might say one or two decent things, but he views it as he pictures the entire nation, which is this giant landmass. It's just all backwards redneck.
And it's not just Soviet Russia. This is Russia as an entity.
It's the entire Russia of the Great Game, and the reason Russia has imperialist tendencies, and that's dangerous. Well, now wait a minute. What about British? What about American imperialism, which, the neoconservatives will come out of this same, even though Quigley later in the book will kind of lay himself out as a third wave proponent, which is what he'll kind of lean towards. The neoconservatives, they're all, Newt Gingrich he wrote out the forward to Alvin Toffler's book. So,
yeah,
neoconservatism is not really in opposition to these kinds of Democratic Carter-Clinton camps that Quigley's coming out of.
Yeah, and even the Cold War period, NATO itself, some people look at it, that was a response to the conditions created by the Second World War and a response to the strategic threat presented by the Soviet Union now that it controls half of Europe. But the plan for NATO predates the war. I mean, even before the war was over, U.S. was planning on a permanent. The United States was planning on a permanent role in Europe.
And if I recall, Quigley will also mention the decision for the European Common Market far prior to, the 90s or whenever it was supposedly public.
Mm-hmm.
He will corroborate the Bilderberg decision for the ECM. He will also go in depth into the OECD, and this backs up, Daniel Estlund's thesis in both his Bilderberg Group book and his Shadowmasters book that this was also a decision made by the same Atlantis establishment. And yeah, what you're talking about with NATO is just it's another angle or another arm of that same decision-making process for the whole continent.
Mm-hmm. And I think it was John Foster Dulles. He said, in order to make the country bear the burden, we had to create an emotional atmosphere akin to wartime psychology. We have to create the idea of a threat from without, because no other way would America had politically accepted the idea of NATO, which, by the way, was sold as a temporary response.
Yeah, supposed to be done by the Cold War period, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, it makes me think too of that ridiculous speech by Reagan at the UN about aliens.
Yeah. Which is another.
We come together.
Yeah, which is a whole other. I guess I think was it the report from Iron Mountain mentioned using alien invasion as a threat if they can't conjure up a foreign threat or something. I don't know.
Yeah, but it illustrates the same point, and as I've discussed in some podcasts and talks, you know, during the Cold War, the science fiction propaganda was also tailored to also be Cold War propaganda, because that's who the aliens are.
Yeah.
The amorphous external threat, which this is basically what the Collins brothers are the thesis of their forthcoming book, Evoking the Beyond.
Yeah.
Is the same idea that if you look at the Cold War threat, the war on terror, some fake alien crap, that's all jumble it all under the same rubric of psychological warfare to create fear and panic, to motivate the public to get behind whatever.
That'd be Invasion of the Body Snatchers or The Thing or something, which was a classic.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the endless science fiction narratives that have the same plots and points. War of the Worlds, right?
Oh yeah, War of the World, or like the Twilight Zone, which is full of episodes that.
Right.
I saw one the other day. I was watching with my kids about a bomb shelter and hysteria that there's a reported nuclear attack coming, and there's one named Foresight buys a bomb shelter, and they attack him and they destroy the bomb shelter in the process, and then it ends up being a false alarm. But he gives a speech how you all are having a good time just worrying about your own life, and I spent money on my bomb shelter. Now you want to come and steal it from me.
Well, another thing you'll notice in all of those, and there's I've watched a whole bunch of them, just kind of analyzing it. The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Pod People, the different Twilight Zone episodes have the same theme. You'll see this tendency towards implanting the idea that they look just like us. Mm-hmm. They're all around us. Right now, I'm not saying that there's no such thing as a foreign operative or Excel or espionage. There is, but the irony is that as Servando Gonzalez says in his excellent psychological warfare book, he makes a great point that a lot of the times the critics of Western imperialism or Pax Americana, American imperialism, they're all out of this Marxist camp, and they won't ever talk. There's two things they won't talk about. They won't talk about who funds Marxism and their group, and they won't. And I'm not talking about people like Noam Chomsky and people like that. They won't talk about that, and they won't talk about secret societies. And so I think Servando Gonzalez's book is excellent. He's really good at pointing all that out about even in the geopolitical critical camps out there, you'll find the fake dialectic of the Marxist groups, right? Who will criticize the banking establishment. They'll criticize Western imperialism, pop culture. Even critical theorists will do this, but they won't ever talk about secret societies, and you can't use the word conspiracy, right? Because they're not looking at the fact that their own Marxist organizations, leftist organizations, liberation organizations, they're all funded by the same foundations. So they won't talk about the CFR. They won't talk about Council on Foreign Relations, the Oxford Roundtable groups, right? That this is no-go zone.
Yeah, it's as if these organizations don't exist, or they're meaningless. That's apparently.
Well, you'll notice too that those groups will even there's a lot of criticism of Zionism from those groups, So they'll champion Palestinian causes. They'll champion banking reform or something like this. They'll talk about Zionism, on and on and on. They won't ever talk about the Oxford Roundtable groups and Rhodes and Milner and these people, because that's the real circle of initiates. And most of these people are the academic dupes that are the helpers on the outside. And this, by the way, this is exactly what Orwell talked about with the inner party and the outer party.
Yeah. And there is a, again, in terms of Zionism itself, the elite themselves, whether it's the advocates of it, may be a part of that. I'm not sure, but they make for a good fall guy when it becomes convenient. It isn't to say that Jewish organizations or Jewish power is above criticism. It should be criticized. The Jews do identify as a group, and they act as a group. When they do act as a group, they should be criticized as a group. There's nothing really wrong with that. But there's an old trick here, like back in the old days when the monarch the Jews would become the middlemen and become the tax farmers. And then when time came, it became politically convenient that the monarch could expel the Jews.
Let me give an example. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Let me give an example. So a lot of the so-called free Palestine, and I'm not trying to take this. I'm not making a point on the Palestinian issue because I'm not adept enough in this position to know. But what I'm saying is that what I have noticed is that a lot of the anti-Zionist free Palestine positions, and I'm not saying that you're wrong for having that view or that you're right, but what I'm saying is that a lot of that will be funded by the United Nations. You'll have UN groups that will play this role of free Palestine, anti-Zionism, and that is just playing into a dialectic because there's documentaries about Palestine that show it to be actually not that bad. So I've not been there, so I don't know. Yeah. I've never been, and then if one documentary shows me a shopping mall and everybody hanging out, eating burritos and having fun, and then another documentary shows it to be concentration camp, I don't know because I've not been there. So I would have to. I've never been to Israel, so I can't speak to the situation on the ground. But I know that in these kinds of hot button issues, they become called celeb, and I have seen even the AP and other organizations. I've seen them fake news about the Palestinian cause. Mm-hmm. Now, why would that be? Right. So
dialectics.
Exactly. Right. Like you can find stories and news footage and so forth of these Palestinian atrocities that are fake.
You mean
a lot of researchers might not want to hear that, but to me, a lot of it looks fake, and I've seen instances of this to hype things up.
Well, it's almost like if you look at probably the most, I guess you could say, the most unattractive critics of Jewish power are probably funded by Jewish organizations. You can see why they'd want that, right?
Well, certainly the provocateur types, yeah.
And that's improved.
But
I'm
just saying I wouldn't buy into all of the immediate furor of something that is Marxist or UN based that is anti-Zionist and free Palestine. Mm-hmm. So I see a lot of researchers and people in alternative media will take the bait and either they'll adopt some radical position on that either way, and then they become myopic, and they can never see the possibility of the UN or the AP faking pro-Palestine stuff.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yeah. Now, in your talk, you get into, I guess you could say, a dialectic regarding finance. You alluded to it earlier. Is how the elite, the Anglo-American elite that Quigley talks.
Well, let me just make one caveat too. Yeah. I'm sorry, I mean to interrupt you, but So that's a very hot button issue that we just talked about. So when we talk about the Anglo-American elite, the one thing that Quigley is very insightful on is that he points out that in all of the nations in the last century, be it Britain or be it the U.S., be it Russia, whoever, the tendency, especially in the Western nations, is for banking dynasties and houses to rise to the top. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't believe that every one of those is Jewish. So, for example, when he discusses the chapter on France, which I will get to in a future lecture, he talks about rival banking dynasties that were Swedish, and he actually talks about Swedish bankers funding the French Revolution, believe it or not. Mm-hmm. Now, these were not, to my knowledge, Jewish, but he goes on to talk about the Jewish banking establishment in France, essentially the Rothschilds.
Yeah.
And then he talks about the Catholic banking establishment. So now I'm not knocking you, and I'm just pointing out that in just the nation of France, he will talk about these three rivalries, and he'll talk about how in the 20th century, I think he says about the 1940s, the Rothschilds had consolidated their banking influence and power in France as one example. Now, then he talks about the 20th century. He talks about Japan. So in Japan, by I think he says around the same period, the 20s, 30s, or 40s, he says 8 banking families had control of almost the entire country of Japan. And guess what? You've probably heard of some of these banking dynasties because they're names like Mitsubishi. So they would actually go on to become corporations. So now, those weren't Jews. Those were Japanese oligarchs. So I'm just making the point that it's a concatenation of usurious persons from various groups. And yes, I know that Genesis 48 or 9 with Joseph talks about usury, and so you could argue that goes back to Mosaic legislation or pre-Mosaic legislation, I guess. So I'm aware of all that. But the point is that the principle of usury will be used by anyone who is viperous.
Yes, and you could say sort of the acceptance of usury in the West, particularly by the Catholic Church, could be a example of, say, Masonic infiltration. Possibly.
I would say absolutely.
Okay, I just say because that's
now. There's some. I guess there's a little room for debate here because I'm aware of Hoffman's works on all this, and I used to have extensive debates when I was a traditional Catholic on this topic of everybody arguing over to what degree usury was allowed or whatever. Now, obviously it is true that the majority opinion in the church prior to the Renaissance and Medici period, where it begins to really become normative, and you have a shift in the papal position on it. The normative position prior to that was that you shouldn't do it, right? But and then of course Calvin argued for it. Interesting side note. Mm-hmm. But iconoclastic Calvinism certainly fits in closer to a Jewish theological mindset. There's no question there. But anyway, all I'm saying is that they're really complex, difficult questions. So there's not an easy catch-all answer to it. But yes, you are correct. I would agree that the principles of usury spread through Masonic influence, Protestant influence, revolutionary influence in Western Catholic countries for sure.
And it's, I guess you could say the problem of usury is magnified by several orders when you have the phenomenon of fractional reserve banking and you have interest being charged on money that's created out of thin air.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And that's what he says in that section on the gold certificates, is that the way that they were able to basically plot the scam was because you charge interest on the inflated gold certificates that you've run out. You run up the number of certificates in circulation, and then you can charge interest based on this exorbitant inflated amount of certificates. Mm-hmm. And that's the same basic principle for all of it, all the way down to the present day. Even though the monetary system is electronic and fiat, it's still the same principle.
And the key there is what Patterson did with the king with England when he opened up the Bank of England was to give it a monopoly on note issues, and you use
exactly, and that's
the power of the
book.
state. Yeah,
it's mentioned. Quigley mentions the Bank of England was setting that out in the charter.
mm-hmm. And so that they have a monopoly on that. So once you give them
why you need. I'm sorry. That's why you need the monopoly on the issuance of the currency.
Yeah, you don't want any competition.
Right. You don't want any competing currencies, and you want to be able to control the flow and the level of currency that's out there, as well as the interest rates and so forth. Right. We saw that with like the LIBOR scam.
Yes. Yeah. And of course, what we have today is what people don't realize is you mentioned the Federal Reserve and the enthronement as a dollar as a de facto reserve currency after World War II. That occurred because in the course of World War II, the United States, I think, accumulated anywhere between 80 to 90% of the known acknowledged gold reserves. So the dollar was in a perfect position because the U.S. had all the gold. Of course, then, obviously, you and I couldn't redeem our notes for gold, but states could. But this is a first step to creating a global currency, because I think at the time, John Maynard Keynes idea was the Bancor, but he said it was too premature. They weren't ready for it. But if you create the dollar as the gold reserve currency, now again, a lot of us as Americans, I guess you could say we derive some benefit from that because we'd be able to finance our consumerism through inflation and let the rest of the world pay for it. But what this did was it created a situation where it's not. Remember, these are Federal Reserve notes, and the question is who owns the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, which he says explicitly. It's the same model in France and all the other countries that adopt this centralized banking model. Is it's not a public bank. It's a facade of a public bank that's owned by banking houses. And it might be 8 in Japan, it might be 20 in the U.S. by the 1940s or wherever, but that's how it works. Yes, exactly.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I want to add one more point too. So you mentioned kind of the classical, neoclassical libertarian ideology, Adam Smith and so forth. Quigley discusses that and says that was a banker plot because there are two things that he says that the bankers wanted. This is, say, back in the 1700s. And the idea was that they wanted, number one, to get government out of any issuance of currency so that there would be absolutely no notion of a public bank or public currency. And the other thing was to have gold standard because the bankers could control the gold because they own the gold. So that was a two-pronged strategy that he talks about during the European shift period, and that's exactly. I think that's crucial because that shows that because the gold standard sounds good, right? I mean, what Ron Paul would argue sounds good, but it's only so good as who actually owns these assets of gold. Now, yes, I understand the shock doctrine and all that, and Nixon, and certainly it was worse to go off of a gold standard onto a fiat situation. Certainly that's worse, but it doesn't mean that 1973 or prior that it was all rosy then, and that wasn't also an older phase of banker plot beta.
Well, there's a Fabian approach going on here.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at when the Fed was first expanded or created in 1913, it was the dollar was 100% backed by gold, and the Fed, I think, the Fed stated, at least it was understood that the Fed could only expand money supply based on collateral paper, marketable paper offered by the banks. But pretty soon, what happens right after the Fed creates, you have World War I. There's an emergency.
Exactly. Yeah, and we'll get into all that. How Quigley will also explain that the boom bust cycle is engineered by the bankers as well.
Well, they create. I mean, I know that sounds conspiratorial, but they create all the levers, all the instruments to do that. Just that.
Yes.
I mean, it's like
Exactly.
if you can if you can goose a market and make money off it, then collapse the market, make money off it, you do it. Well, just one thing. Yeah, you mentioned the Japanese bankers and the French bankers, the Swedish bankers, and this is what we're dealing with, kind of with this elite group or separate group of banksters that get together and work these things out. But they probably, like any gangster, they probably fight it out amongst each other. There's an idea that
sure.
I read by Buckminster Fuller, and idea of the biggest, baddest pirates. They go in and they find the local pirate and they beat him up and they say, okay, now you're going to work for us. It's kind of like what we did to Japan.
Well, this is the situation Quigley describes well, off the top of my head, I think of three examples that we just mentioned. So in the U.S., he says that by 1900.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is prior to 1913. There were 20 families, I believe he says. I may get the numbers, the figures mixed up, but I believe he said there were 20 families in the U.S. that controlled 50% of the nation's assets. So, I mean, that's a tremendous amount of consolidation, right? And I mean, if you can control, you can control 50%, you can kind of pretty much sway the entire country.
Yeah, because the other 50% isn't organized.
Exactly, they're smaller. It's a whole bunch of fragmented people. In Japan, 8 families in the 20s, 30s, or 40s, and so what he says happens is they knock each other out and consume and consolidate. And so he says in France, you had you had the Swedish Protestant, or you had Protestants, Protestant bankers in France, Catholic bankers in France, Jewish bankers in France, and over a period of a few decades, Rothschild came out on top.
Yeah.
So the same model, Mitsubishi, maybe Mazda. I forget some of the names of there were 8 of them, and Quigley says they were duking it out. They were the Mitsubishis hated the Mazdas or whoever, and so it took a few decades, and it got down to 3 or 4 standing.
And this was the power behind the throne there. I mean, this is the emperor.
Yeah, you have this. Yeah. You have this emperor who's kind of like puppet guy, right?
Yeah, it's like here. Your political puppets put up.
Yeah, because we're in Homo economicus. We're not living in the age of the Knights of the Round Table, right? I mean, the Knights of the Oxford Round Table are a bunch of ugly bankers. They're not Lancelot, right?
So you have this dialectic occurring in finance. It's all for concentration, and that's what's occurring. If you look at the broad picture, it's all towards concentration and control. So,
and that's mirrored in Huxley's philosophy. One of the great ideologues of this whole ethos. If you read his book on the perennial philosophy, he says it's all about oneness. It's all about oneness, right? What's the dollar bill say? E pluribus unum, out of many one.
Mm-hmm. And once you have control of the printing press, you have control of the finances. Money it's just an instrument to you. It's not really, because the key there is controlling the resources.
It's the assets and the resources.
Yeah,
absolutely. That's what it's about. Yeah.
And once you do that, you can direct anything.
Yeah, it's also the time and energy, which I guess could be classed as resources or assets of future generations, and that's what most people don't see or don't think about, things being thinking long term, thinking intergenerationally, which is how humans used to think, and now we have been socially engineered into thinking here and now. Just do it, Nike, do what that will, Crowley. We don't think in terms of grandchildren. I'm saying like the millennials. Obviously, you believe in your think about your grandchildren, but and that's where we want to go.
Yeah, this happens when you destroy ethnic-based communities, create suburbia.
Yes.
I mean, if you have a family home, you think about posterity. If you're looking to flip the home because FHA is offering you a 30-year mortgage at a discounted rate, or you can get a cheap interest rate and you can flip up and get a bigger home, a nicer home. borrow for it, you're going to do that, and it creates the very thing that's supposed to be great with stable communities. It creates destabilized communities, which is probably the real goal of that whole thing to begin with, anyway.
Absolutely.
Yep. I had a conversation this weekend about that, talking about mortgages and FHA, and the person was, actually, it's good. It promotes home ownership and stable communities. So look around you. Is that what you see? It's the opposite. It's the complete opposite of what it does, because people, they want to flip, they want to buy, they want to do that, or they buy too much, so it gets foreclosed upon. So you have 10 houses that are empty because the bank doesn't want to admit that it's a non-performing loan. They want to defraud their shareholders. It creates this whole cascading event of corruption and destabilization and erosion in the community.
Well, and the great irony is that it's all for money. I mean, it'd be one thing, it'd be bad enough if everybody was selling everybody out for gold. They're not even selling each other. They're selling each other out for fiat currency that's backed by nothing.
Yeah, currently. I was listening to talk about this sort of this homo economicus, sort of this utilitarian approach towards economics. Yeah. And I've heard a couple other people talk about this, whether it's Catherine Austin Fitts and David Steele, the former CIA guy, talking about even the importation of drugs into a community can be part of a gentrification program. And you say, how? It says, well, you can destroy a community through drugs. And within 10 to 20 years, the property values plummet. And within 20 years, all of a sudden, you buy everything up for a song and you gentrify it, you sell it at a profit. Now, you and I don't think this way. But the people that run these corporations and banking operations do think this way. And what's strange about it is it's all integrated. Drugs into financial or real estate speculation. It
is, yeah.
Yeah.
I was talking to a person who did some high-level technological work in terms of naval research, and he was opining about his experiences in dealing with kind of higher-ups in military and so forth. And I was curious because you and I, we read this stuff and we think all this, believe all this, and you start to you wonder how many of these people in the establishment have a clue, right? Because you would think that more of them would, but then his opinion was that even kind of high up in the holes of government, most people don't get this. And that's what Catherine Austin Fitts backs that up too. She'll say, I was doing my job for so long and I didn't really get all the scams, and then, it kind of dawned on me, and you start to put the pieces together. And so, I guess you have to, basically what I'm getting at is that you kind of have to get pretty high up on the chain before, people really start figuring this out, to the Kissinger, Brzezinski level of stuff. But you would think more people would who work in the system would see that kind of stuff, especially what you're talking about with strategies of wrecking communities with drugs, and then you can gentrify it and so forth.
Well, I mean, an educated person would know that this is precisely what the British East India Company did to China.
Exactly, I was going to say with opium. Yeah.
So what makes you think that you're immune to that? Because you're white?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is the history of it's the history of opium, the Opium Wars. I think it's the part of the history to the Vietnam War is the creating markets for heroin in the United States, selling helicopters.
Exactly. That's Yeah, I agree. And that interview with Chris Milligan was very insightful in that regard. Yeah.
And that goes back to the Huxley thing about opiating the masses.
Uh-huh.
So,
but it really is. It really is full. I mean, we hear the term full spectrum dominance. It really is.
It's and you talk to. So I talk to people. In their 60s, they're retired. They dwell in corporate world, and they'll be talking. I'll be at a party or a gathering. They'll be talking about certain things, and E. Michael Jones expressed this well one time. He said, I used to have views that were fit for polite society. I am no longer fit for polite society. And that's how I feel. I can't bring a lot of this stuff up because there's so much misunderstanding about these things. But they're talking about the Central Intelligence Agency, just talking about it. And why it was created. And I said, well, you realize that it's created under a big lie. So one of the reasons it was created was because the idea that the intelligence community failed to connect the dots regarding Pearl Harbor. So that is they knew exactly what was coming. They provoked it, knew it was coming. So it's all based on a lie. And this person had no idea that there was even a controversy regarding Pearl Harbor.
I like the way Servando Gonzalez put it in his book, where he was saying to understand intelligence analysis, you basically can look at it like whenever the CIA or these organizations are touting something as a great success, it was probably a failure. And the things that they're calling immense failures and intelligence failures and so forth were great successes.
Yeah. You know, so I mean, they have or if you just talk to someone, whether it's regarding something basic like the something like the Kennedy assassination. I said, if you don't have trouble with that, the official narrative, then I don't know how you can have any understanding of what's really going on in the world.
Yeah, well, I think those baby boomer and older generations were so hit by, pretty hardcore and advanced propaganda and so forth, and psychological warfare through media and music and culture and so forth in their period, that it's very, very, very difficult for them to see outside of those kinds of constraints. And they're not. A lot of them are not used to the internet and so forth, and the ready availability of knowledge. And then I think that, and I'm not saying I'm greatly sophisticated, but it took my grandmother. I'm not kidding. Up to the year that she died, mid '80s, and she finally said to my mom one day, it was pretty funny. She said, I don't think I believe that government story about JFK. But it took her to 85 to decide that. That was last year. She died last year at 85. So it took her that long to decide that. And it's, I'm sitting there. I'm not meaning to be arrogant, but I was sitting there thinking, that was like pretty obvious, right?
Well, it's but yeah, I know what you're saying.
Well, and it's the same way with the guy that I was talking to with the baby. I was like, I'm thinking, did these even generals or do they not? I mean, surely they're aware of the concept of false flag. I mean, does this? So maybe they just don't want culpability. You know what I mean? Like I've talked to a lot of people who will say things like, I just don't. I don't want to know that stuff. I mean, I've got my job. I do whatever. My information is compartmentalized. I don't need to know that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's still what you get because it's so upsetting to people, to their worldview. It's
exactly, yeah.
They just don't, and they have to start rethinking it. What you were saying, I had a sibling say to me, he says, "Well, why didn't they teach me that in college?" So that's what you should ask yourself. Why would you rely on a college to teach you anything? Why would you trust a college or the news for that matter? And I think you've said a number of times there, you can point out examples of fake news and then show them, they got a famous CNN thing that you mentioned. And if my point is, once I see that, I don't trust anything I watch on the news. I don't know. Why would you?
Yeah, and then 2 weeks later, you watched CNN last night?
Yeah.
No, I don't watch CNN unless I'm monitoring it for baloney or whatever.
But I remember when my dear mother was still alive. I finally, I broached the topic of 9/11 at a family gathering, just asking questions. I never really came out and said, "This is what happened." I said, "No, well, answer this, answer this, answer this." I couldn't get any answers. But my mother's hearing it. And then a few weeks later, she's in the hospital, and I go to visit her at the hospital, and she's worried that I was asking these questions. And she goes, her response was, "That's not something you say to someone my age."
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's the kind of response, and nobody, 10, 20 years older wants to hear some whippersnapper, telling them something.
Yeah, I understand that. And, like I said, I self-censor all the time. That's how you cope. That's the only way you can cope.
Yeah, but I mean, even when you try to pull in people from that generation, well, here's Dr. Paul Roberts. He was Reagan's, and the Secretary of Treasury and so forth. Look what he says about false flags, right? But it's like, well, whatever.
Oh yeah, well then you have someone like a former Secretary of State of Treasury saying it. I guess he's crazy too. Okay, they're all crazy. Yeah. So, but as far as I mean, you mentioned the financing thing. And I understand what you're saying is again they've the gold standard was part of a phase, a dialectic, if you will, to monopolize money, and they succeeded in doing that. You also mentioned, you alluded to it when you were talking earlier about fake media, and particularly in the run up to World War One. And I know there is a speech by Senator Callaway in 1917. He was opposed to U.S. entry into the war, and he talked about how an attempt by J.P. Morgan to buy up 25 newspapers and to promote the war agenda. And the media being controlled back in the second decade of the 20th century. And this was largely done because, of course, J.P. Morgan was an agent of the Rothschilds, and his banking house and Wall Street in general were tied to Great Britain financially, the Eastern Seaboard elite, and that's how they dragged the country into the First World War, coupled with all the propaganda that you mentioned.
And I would add too that Cecil Rhodes and De Beers and gold and diamond mining in Africa was also funded by the Rothschilds, according to both Quigley and I think Roberts, biographer of Rhodes.
And his wealth, some people think he never really controlled, or his Rothschilds, which is why he set up the trust, because the Rhodes Trust funds the Milner's Kindergarten. It establishes the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which I guess also establishes the Council of Foreign Relations. They work in tandem together, and to establish or to achieve the goals of this Anglo-American elite. At the same time, you have the Zionist intrigues, which you mentioned earlier, and this is involved Chaim Weizmann, who was a financier who was financing much of the British war effort. But the deal there was, if the British were to sign on to this Balfour Declaration, then Bernard Baruch and Louis Brandeis and the Warburg family, they would, exert Jewish influence in the United States to bring the country into the war. And so, I mean, then again, you have this British Zio, confluence or alliance here working, which is something I quite haven't sorted out yet, but it is there. Of course,
I wonder, could
Hollywood, which gets more of a factor in the Second World War. So
there's all kinds of course, theories and possibilities in regard to that. I wonder if there couldn't be something to the various theories that have been put forth about Scottish and Khazar and this kind of stuff, having some connection way back when. I don't know. I have no idea. I've just looked at different books that have proposed this theory. But yeah, so you have Jews in England for a long time, and who knows? I don't know.
Well,
I don't know that anybody. I don't know that anybody knows unless you could maybe show it through DNA or something like that.
One thing that was interesting is regarding I mentioned Cromwell earlier, and of course Cromwell, his sect, I guess the Pilgrims, right? Not the Pilgrims. What do you call it again? I'm sorry.
Wasn't Cromwell a Congregationalist?
Oh, what was it? They became. They went to.
Yeah, I mean, he believed in independent church government as opposed to Anglicanism or anything like that.
Well, you have Cromwell's government in England after he beheaded Charles I. Then you have the Pilgrims who are forced to leave. They first go to Amsterdam, then they come to the United States. But the idea was that their outlook on life, once was Judaic, meaning they sought a political messiah, change the world, make the whole world new, and this sort of messianism informed their politics. The Pilgrims come.
There's some truth to that. I might have to disagree a little bit because I attended actually a puritanical college and seminary for a little while.
Looking for I was looking for the term puritanical. Puritans, yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, so now a lot of the Puritans in their theology will be pretty explicitly anti quote Jew. So they will believe that the Jews are not the chosen people theologically. But this kind of hinges on interpreting the relationship of the New Testament to the Old. And that's a big part of it, and this is where it gets into the theology, and I've read a lot of the Puritans extensively. And the Puritans have a very strict continuity view between the Old and the New Testament, so they tended to believe in the abiding validity of the civil laws and the moral laws of Mosaic legislation. And so what most of the Puritans were agreed on the cessation, as it's called, of the ceremonial laws. So the Puritans would divide up between moral, legislative or civil and ceremonial laws, and so those would be fulfilled in Christ, but the abiding validity of the penal sanctions of even Deuteronomy and so forth. Calvin argues for this in his commentary on Deuteronomy and so forth, and this is where you get Cotton Mather would hold to this view, for example. And that's why witches are put to death, because Deuteronomy says put witches to death, and I think Deuteronomy 18. So that's, in that sense, you could argue Judaic, but if you mean by Judaic as the people who I think are a little off who make this argument Talmudism, well, I mean, the Puritans weren't Talmudic, right? So that doesn't make much sense to me. But yeah, that might be
I was just saying they become the Puritans.
That might be minutia.
Yeah, I know. Just because the Puritans become the Yankees, and their war against the South was messianic, and so it kind of informs that.
Well, that's true. That's a good point.
So look at how it informs the culture, the political culture, in 2-3 centuries later. I thought that was an interesting connection that I've come across.
Well, they certainly held the view that the acquisition of material wealth was a sign of divine providence. So yes.
Yeah, and that informs the gospel of the wealth. The gospel of wealth that you hear.
Which is a uniquely American
gospel of prosperity.
Yes. Yeah.
So, but one of the interesting points you brought up in your talk was the use of media, and this, of course, we talked about that. I just mentioned that regarding the Senator Callaway, how the Eastern J.P. Morgan Eastern elite bought up these newspapers to more or less spread war fever, to make the British argument for U.S. entry into the war. And you mentioned the Lusitania, how that was set up, and I think that's the evidence kind of bears that out now. Whether how obviously getting a British ship with Americans on it sunk would help drag the country into the war. But you, of course, in World War I, Hollywood wasn't quite the factor, because that's the beginning of the silent movie era. But it plays a much bigger factor in the Second World War. And you mentioned in your talk, as you were, I guess, near the end, the British influence in Hollywood, the Quarter Circle.
Right.
And the profusion of pro-British music that came out in the 30s, just in the run-up to the war. wasn't
That's a great point, yeah. No coincidence, absolutely. Yeah, all the irregulars are also pretty much designed to influence Hollywood. And that was a big part of Ian Fleming's role. Hitchcock played a role in this. Let's see, Roald Dahl, one of the heads of MGM, was one of these Quarter Circle. Who else? Noel Coward. By the way, they're all hanging out with Walt Disney.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And Disney was completely taken over by the War Department during the war.
Exactly, and they're also at the Lookout Mountain Studios too. And
it's right. And I think I mentioned in a comment that the the year that the ground was broken for Disneyland in California, that's the year MK Ultra started, and they both involved SRI. So,
exactly. Good point. Right.
Stanford Research Institute. And I think you've done talks, and other people have done talks about their connections between Disney, amusement parks, entertainment, and MK Ultra. I think you said in the past that entertainment is MK Ultra.
I believe so. Yeah.
Yeah. So, one of the interesting points you talked about, I do want to mention before the night our talk ends tonight, is the. I think you posted an article not too long after your talk regarding Western support for communism. And
yeah, that was actually. Yeah.
So I want to get into that a little bit. That's interesting.
Sure. Yeah, this was now, of course, as Sir Monto Gonzalez points out, you can't always trust CIA leaks and declassifications. A lot of times those are limited hangouts and disinformation, misinformation. But this one is actually borne out in several sources. So if you read bios of Wild Bill Donovan, you'll find whole chapters where he discusses training Mao's guerrillas. And then books on Chinese intelligence, you'll see, I forget the name of the authors of that, but I have it at home. But they discuss Donovan setting up basically all of the intelligence apparatus in China and Mao's China. So it wasn't just trained guerrillas, it was also setting up Chinese intelligence. So, and these were networks that were reporting to the OSS. So the declassified CIA document discusses that training of the guerrillas. But what's more interesting is the relationship of Mao as a Yali, or a Yale in China, which I dug up at the Rockefeller Asia Society. So that is actually not on the web anymore, but you can find it at archive.org, where the Asia Society article still exists about Mao being a Yale in China student, which would be Skull and Bones. And you can begin to see the subterfuge that would potentially be at work here. Mm-hmm. He would regularly meet with this Western journalist named Snowden, of all things, if I recall. Isn't that weird? Yeah, and then so what I also discussed in that article was the CFR history from the CFR site where they get into Pratt House and how it was established, and then how there was an attempt to bring about the third wave blending in the 40s. And if I were going from memory, but you had kind of the half of the CFR guys for it, half of them against it. So the big Cold Warrior guys were not for this. The more, quote, liberal-minded ones were. And this was going to be brought about through the offering of billions to Stalin. And I'd like to get your opinion on this, because you would know I kind of took it like it was completely staged, but Kerry Bolton has an interesting argument that Quigley argues that Stalin did not take those reparations, and therefore there was a kind of opposition from Stalin where he wasn't willing to be bought. I'm not saying that makes Stalin a good guy. I'm just saying, in trying to determine the level of ruse at work here,
yeah.
Do you have an opinion on that? Are you familiar with the Kerry Bolton piece?
I'm not familiar with the Kerry Bolton piece in particular, but I am familiar with that issue regarding the Marshall Plan money and ideas.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, I didn't mean to say reparations. I meant the Marshall Plan money.
Yeah. I think what happened, I think you kind of get that. I look at it as sort of a kind of a right and left wing dispute within the elite. This is roughly the Dulles wing versus the Hiss wing.
Exactly.
Sorry, Dulles versus Morgenthau, perhaps. There's different factions, because you have the Morgenthau, who are I guess you could say the Jewish Zionist influence within the Treasury Department, and versus the Dulles wing, which is more the WASP wing. And that's you have to look at these as different factions. And maybe you have the more commie wing like Hiss, but they're all these are all at a meta level, they're all being controlled. With respect to the thesis in your talk, and also what Quigley talks about in Tragedy and Hope. This is all being controlled. So you have all these operatives that are kind of doing their thing and following orders. So that's where you get the dispute. So I I think what happened was the Dulles wing won out right after World War II, and they got the Cold War.
Uh-huh.
And he had brought in all the Nazis in, like Reinhard Gehlen and Otto Skorzeny and these stuff. And so it was almost maybe it was somewhere a decision was taken that they needed a Cold War to further consolidate.
So would that throw a wrench into the thesis that Stalin was basically working for Zionist interests because Stalin kind of expelled Jews?
Yes, well, that was the Dawkins plot. But remember, many of his executioners in the 30s were Jewish. Kaganovich in the Ukraine, which factored into the formation of the SS.
Well, but didn't Stalin supposedly turn on the Jews, and that's why the Israel was supposedly going to be either pro-Stalin or pro-U.S. And then when Stalin quote turned on Jews,
I think he did.
Israel.
I did, but part of the explanation of that could be because most of the first generation Bolsheviks were Jews. So when he turned on them,
well, but wouldn't that be the Trotskyites and all that? And
the Trotskyites,
and then Stalin has Trotsky killed, right?
Yeah, later on, because one thing is I've heard some people think that Trotsky might have been a German agent at some level, and that's you're getting into the real, in the real thickets here, so it's hard to really know what exactly.
Really hard stuff, yeah.
Yeah, I think what happened was Stalin, much like Hitler later on, kind of went his own way and had to be, taken
reined back in.
Yeah, reined back in. Now, whether Stalin died a natural death or was murdered, within that circle, but anything, he was 74 years old. But he also could have been murdered. Some people think that Stalin believed that that Roosevelt was murdered.
So kind of like a Saddam or a Gaddafi type thing.
Yeah. So taken out. But I think what happened was at some level the Cold War dialectics served the interest of the elite. They certainly made a lot of money.
Sure.
Throughout the Cold War, David Rockefeller could land in Moscow and meet with anybody.
Yeah, and it allowed for the build-up of the great tech grid. And this is where we get the internet. Yeah,
all that. And so at that level, it's almost like that speech that Ned Beatty gives at a network to Howard Beale. I think that's how the world really operates.
Yeah, the nations are not America and Russia. It's CBS and Apple and
You're an old man who thinks in terms of nations and states. The world is one organic thing, all bound together. Dollars. It's like all one big business plan. It's all one big business plan.
Right.
So
I think I might have to go pretty soon, but it's been a great talk.
Okay, great. Yeah. So just wanted that it is that we mentioned the use of missionaries. There was in China, and I had talked with Mark Hackett about that. How both intelligence agencies, particularly CIA, always use missionary groups, particularly Protestant ones in Latin America. But they used in the Philippines as well to serve out intelligence operations. And so it's not too surprising that Yale Divinity School would be operating some sort of intelligence operation in China to destabilize China because they wanted to undermine Sun Yat-sen, who was a Chinese nationalist.
Well, interestingly, though, there's also an argument to be made that Sun Yat-sen was preparation for Mao.
I know.
And so, Sun Yat-sen was actually a Mason, and I'm not quite proudly so. All the Chinese Masons.
Okay,
yes, Sun Yat-sen was supposed to be a Mason and revolutionary as well, also holding to all these Western ideas. Quote Western ideas, which are Masonic, revolutionary, quote democratic nationalist ideas, and then he prepares the way for Mao and also for the double cross of Chiang Kai-shek. Not that Chiang Kai-shek is good, if I recall. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Chiang Kai-shek was a nationalist, and he was the gangster, who. Then he,
and Quigley discusses. I remember now that. Chiang Kai-shek started out as kind of this Sun Yat-sen revolutionary, and then eventually married into the banking dynasty.
Yes, Madam Chiang, and that that gets into the heroin, opium and heroin, which bleeds into Vietnam and blah blah blah. Then you're off for the races. Yeah. Okay. Well, Jay, listen, I'm going to let you go. Before I let you go, I want to plug your show. Okay, this is the first episode of Tragedy and Hope. Your analysis. You're going to do about 8 or 9, you say?
I think that's what it'll come out to. If the first show was about the first 200 pages, I think we're looking at 7, 8, 9 episodes. And I would please encourage listeners to subscribe for $4.95 a month or for $60 yearly, and you'll get all the past interviews and talks, Plato lectures and so forth, and many, many more to come. So, we'll go through Tragedy and Hope, and then eventually do more Plato, do some more Aristotle, and I'd like to eventually do some theology again, get back into the Bible and things like that. So that's
cool.
What we're looking forward to.
And what you do is you post roughly half the lecture as a sample or a teaser, and for those who do subscribe, they get the full lecture.
Yeah, and everybody, I would say I have a probably 95% approval rating from the subscribers, and more every day. So, please do that, because that really just allows me to continue to do, more of what I'm doing. So, if you like it, you can support me. You'll get more and more and more output from me.
Yeah, exactly. That's jasonanalysis.com. And your book, again, you're expected to be fall now? Esoteric Hollywood?
That's what we're thinking. Yeah, Esoteric Hollywood, Sex, Cults, and Symbols. And you can still pre-order that at TrineDay.com, TrineDay Publishers, or on Amazon.
Excellent. Okay, anything else you want to add? Or
no, I think that'll be good. Be sure to the lecture 2 will be available either tonight or tomorrow, everybody can look for that.
Great. Okay. Listen, well, Jay, thanks for taking time out of your tour to talk to me tonight. It's great you spent a lot of time with me tonight, and we'll talk again soon, perhaps. And I'll look forward to that lecture coming out soon. And good night.
All right. Thanks, Tim.
Thanks. Bye-bye.